And Russia's invasion of Ukraine back in 2014 and continuing up until today put millions of refugees on the road. It has disrupted food and energy shipments out of Ukraine to other continents. Prosperity is threatened by this war. A ceasefire is not an outcome. That's a step. The strategic outcome should be Russia lives inside its own borders like everybody else does and stops attacking its neighbors. And so that's why we ended up with so many bad policy decisions during the Biden administration.
We saw Trump make an about face, seemingly overtly supporting Ukraine and now willing to send military aid through NATO to that country. What do you make of that? All right. So welcome back to Brave New Something, the podcast where we explore global conflict, geopolitical changes, and speak to the people who are shaping our collective future. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who is, of course, a distinguished military leader and really one of the sharpest voices on European security and on NATO's evolving posture. As the former commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe, General Hodges has been at the center of America's forward defense in Europe, and he brings really deep insight into the battlefield realities of Ukraine, the future of deterrence, the role of alliances, and all of this within the context of course, resurgent authoritarianism. From Cold War doctrine to drone warfare, from the Black Sea to the Baltics, we're unpacking really what it means to defend the West in the 21st century and where we go from here. So stay tuned, because this really is not just armchair quarterbacking. This is about true leadership. It's about sharp analysis and a frontline view of a world in transition. And so without further ado, well, let's get into it. General Hodges, let me first of all, thank you for being here. I'm immensely grateful for your time.
Well, thank you very much for the privilege, Mark. And I love any chance I get to speak to my Canadian friends.
Thank you so much. So let me lob one over the plate before I get into the detailed questions that I so much want to know about. That you've been following the conflict in Ukraine closely from day one. We've all been watching you on CNN as you kind of have been helping us understand what's been going on out there. To your mind, what's the single most important thing that people still do not fully understand about that conflict? What is it that you would want the world to know?
Well, I would want Canadians and Americans and Europeans to understand why it matters to us, that what we're doing for Ukraine is not charity or because we're inspired by the brave people of Ukraine, although we are. This is about our strategic interests. America's economic prosperity is tied directly to European prosperity, and European prosperity depends on stability and security in Europe. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine back in 2014 and continuing up until today put millions of refugees on the road. It has disrupted food and energy shipments out of Ukraine to other continents. And it has created a situation where prosperity is threatened by this war. And of course, if the Ukrainians capitulate, if they ultimately fail, now you're talking about a Russia that will absorb tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops. They will be on the border with Moldova and then probably Latvia, which is a NATO country. So now you've got the possibility of NATO countries being directly involved in the war if we don't help Ukraine win. And then the final thing, of course, I believe that China is watching to see, are we really serious about respect for sovereignty, international law? Does the West have the political will to do what needs to be done to stop Russia? And if the Chinese see that we don't, then I think that emboldens them as well.
Right. And I think you make an excellent case for the need for that support. And perhaps that leads into I guess the question I have to ask you, just because I want to talk about current events and then I really want to get into a systemic analysis of what's happening out there. But current events vis-a-vis Ukraine change fast, and this week was no exception. This week, mid-July, we're recording now in mid-July, we saw Trump make an about face and come down hard on Russia in a way we really haven't seen since he entered public life really 10 years ago. seemingly overtly supporting Ukraine and now willing to send military aid through NATO to that country. What do you make of that?
So I have to say that yesterday's big announcement was somewhat of a letdown because um, the first thing you hear about is, okay, we're going to sell Patriot and other weapons to European countries who are then going to hand them over to the Ukrainians. Or European countries are going to hand over what they have, and then we will replace that when they buy it from us. So the whole thing turned into a big, like, real estate deal. There's no statesmanship here. It's a deal for business, and I know that's his style. And I'm for anything that gives more capability to Ukraine. Don't get me wrong, but that was what came through loud and clear. And then the other part was that why 50 days? Why, does he tell Vladimir Putin, if you don't, if we don't have a negotiated settlement in 50 days, I'm going to unleash, tariffs or sanctions on you? Well, how many times have we heard that already? And then why do we think Putin and Lavrov need 7 more weeks to think about whether or not they want to negotiate? So, in other words, what he did, he greenlighted the Russians for the next 7 weeks. Go ahead and finish doing whatever you're doing. That's that's how much time you have before we decide we'll give you a couple more weeks. So I have to say I'm a skeptic of this. The biggest thing that was missing from yesterday was what's the strategy? I mean, what is the strategic end state? And the Biden administration failed this as well, as have all of the Canadian governments and European governments. We have never said this is the outcome we're trying to achieve. A ceasefire is not an outcome. That's a step. But the strategic outcome should be Russia lives inside its own borders like everybody else does and stops attacking its neighbors. That should be our
Right.
end state. And then we do everything necessary to help them. There was no mention of that in what the president said yesterday. It was only about this big deal.
I take your point of the difference between tactics and strategy for sure, and the lack of strategic overall thought that may actually um, accompany some of the decisions that were made yesterday. I'm happy to see the river flowing in a direction that I can support, if you will, but I understand how boots on the ground matter and tactically what is going to happen next needs to be guided by a larger prism and understanding of what it is we're trying to achieve. So I very much appreciate what you're saying
Well,
there.
you can't develop effective policy if you don't have an overarching strategy that the policy is supposed to help achieve. I mean, that's true in any business or in sports. I mean, you have to have what's the end state you're trying to achieve. And we never did have that under the Biden administration, despite all the good things that they were doing to try and help. The height of it was we're with you for as long as it takes. That's not an end state. And so that's why we ended up with so many bad policy decisions during the Biden administration about Ukraine. And so it's frustrating to see the Trump administration making the same mistake of not clearly identifying what it is this is all about.
It's interesting because the last person that we interviewed on this podcast was talking about China and specifically China from a strategic perspective and how they have, for 10, 20, 30 years now, been geared towards an industrialized strategy, which seemingly, by the way, is directly now impacting how wars in modern days are fought. So, to that end, maybe I can start turning my attention to um, some deeper questions about mechanisms of war that are being taught to us through the Ukraine experience. Specifically, I'd like to just bring it off that point. Uh, you know, Thinking about China, in a world where, you have an ability to scale and innovate, and that seems to matter a bit more than the ability to build large infrastructure heavy equipment. How do world powers respond to places like China and their dominance in manufacturing and innovation? Does the US, for example, more directly need to involve itself in Canada as well in its manufacturing sectors as a matter of national security in an effort to drive the strategies that allow for whatever tactics it is that we're going to be bringing to play.
So the industry has always been a strategic strength and a strategic interest. The access to critical minerals right now is the latest example of the realization that China, controls the processing of a huge part of those critical minerals that are needed for most uh, high-end weapon systems and vehicles, et cetera, that we use. So the industry side is always going to be a part of the strategic consideration. Now, the type of industries are going to be dependent on what do we think the threat is. Obviously, if your principal threat seems to be China, the long-term pacing threat, sometimes referred to, uh, you're talking about a maritime theater and an air domain. So the U.S. Department of Defense has prioritized an air and sea power and space-based capabilities to be able to deter China from making a terrible decision. And so Europe, which is more of a land domain, will be a sec over time is becoming a lesser priority. It's just why the government's trying to shift. Well, that means then they start looking at our shipbuilding industry, which is uh, no longer up to the task. It takes a very long time just to do maintenance on nuclear submarines. So that part of the industry, or the long-range precision weapons that could strike a Japanese long-range precision weapons that could strike a Chinese vessel, for example, but also protecting all of our transportation infrastructure from cyber attacks. This is a part of it as well, because of the distances involved in the Pacific. It takes 9 days to sail a U.S. Navy vessel for a U.S. Navy vessel to go from Hawaii to Japan. 9 days. I mean, that's enormous distances. I know for Canadians, that's, maybe doesn't seem like such a big deal, but for a ship at sea, you've got to be able to respond. And the Chinese, of course, have a different strategic challenge from us.
Hmm. It strikes me that there is the need to plan for offensive operations and continue to allow for North America and its allies to have strategic reach across the world. But as Ukraine is really showing us, it's also important for us to be thinking about defense. Specifically, if I may bring up the Operation Spiderweb that took place recently in Ukraine. Now, for the listeners, just to remind you, Operation Spiderweb was the instance where shipping containers were converted into effective drone deployments that they were able to bring near our airfields to take out good sections of the Russian Air Force. Um, and I guess my question to you, in addition to building huge industries, as you mentioned, the ships and everything else, what does security look like to countries that now have to defend against cheap, relatively easy to produce scaled attacks? Which I think must be on the mind of our military leaders. What long-term implications, now that such technologies have moved beyond sci-fi and are now actively being field deployed, do we need to take into account?
I think that what the Ukrainians did with Spider's Web was foreshadowed in that book, Ghost Fleet, where you had, similar deployments of drones. And this was a book that was written, I think, like 10 years ago. So you're right that reality has caught up with and passed science fiction in terms of these capabilities. And what impressed me so much about what they did was that they demonstrated to the Russians that not 1 square kilometer of Russia is untouchable. I
Right.
mean, psychologically, for the Russians, they've always been able to depend on, the vastness of Russian territory And even during World War II, as the German Wehrmacht was moving east, the Russians relocated most of their heavy industry behind the Ural Mountains to get it out of reach of the Germans. Now, you can't do that anymore. Everywhere is reachable.
But General, didn't they not also demonstrate that to us? I mean, they weren't threatening us directly, but I mean, I thought the lesson was incumbent upon North America has always been sheltered by its shores. North
Yeah.
America has always felt a relative measure of security as well. But I mean, I think what Ukraine was demonstrating to Russia was being demonstrated to the whole world.
Yeah, so you can be sure that everybody that's responsible for Homeland Security, as well as port managers and airbase, airfield operators, you know that this is something they have to deal with. Now, it's always been the case that you could never defend everything. There's not enough air defense capabilities on the planet to defend everything that is important. So your leaders are always going to have to prioritize what airports and seaports or what parts of seaports have to be protected at all costs and where can we take risk. So that's going to be a part of it. I think that probably the various things that are done to scan, for example, containers that are coming in. It's probably given the volume of containers that move in and out of our ports in North America every week, it's impossible to check them all. But maybe the numbers that are checked, that increases.
I think we're
But
at 1 or 2% being checked at the present time. It was a
yeah,
stat that was thrown out on the show.
that's what I'm saying. That's not enough. If you want to have more confidence, or maybe this is not such a threat. And again, this is where our civilian leaders and military leaders have to do the risk analysis of, okay, what is the threat? What do we need to do to mitigate that risk and still be able to protect all of our interests, both at home as well as being able to project power? You're right that Canada and the United States, we've been blessed with our geography. We had friendly neighbors most of the time, and two gigantic oceans and the Arctic. And of course, Canada has so much responsibility for the Arctic. Now you have to be thinking about who are those threats. And most people, our average citizens that don't spend their life dealing with this, but are going about their lives, doing their business, their jobs, whatever, have to be convinced that these threats are real. And that's why you have to invest in the capabilities needed to protect freedom of navigation, respect for international law, airspace, our ability to move from North America across the Pacific or across the Atlantic. It's very expensive.
Hmm. Uh, all excellent points. Um, there's so many questions that I really want to address just because I think the Ukraine war is such a seminal event in our lifetime and such a turning point, depending on what the outcome is, one way or the other.
Yeah.
I'll speak as a 50-year-old guy. I'm a couple of months shy, but I am there now, unfortunately. We're all a product of our own generations, and I'm a product, I think, of post-Vietnam, where there was a reticence to lose individuals on the battlefield, where we showed that we didn't have an appetite for massive loss. And I think that that really infected our politics, infected possibly in a good way, not meaning it in a derogatory sense of the term, for a long period of time, where boots on ground was something that we were wary of, and it probably helped us keep out of some conflicts. Not all, clearly, but perhaps some. Um, we're quickly, and I think now to Ukraine, and I see a sea change taking place. We're quickly reaching a point where robotics and AI are being fused, and the costs of both of them are falling very quickly. One of the traditional barriers to military conflict in the West has really been our inability to absorb significant personnel loss. I think you see the difference between that and what's happening in Russia today. Um, does I think what we're seeing now is the beginning of the non-manned military. And my question to you about that, because I'm seeing that in Ukraine as we speak, does the non-manned military mean lesser restraints on the use of force insofar as the boots on the ground are not with heartbeat?
So let me touch on the setup of your very good question, willingness to accept casualties. And my sense is that certainly Americans are willing to accept casualties if they believe it's for a worthy cause, if they understand why. Um, where they're not is when it's not clear, like why the hell are we in Iraq, or why are we in Afghanistan? What's this about? Then people, their patience with casualties correctly uh, goes decreases.
It's a very
And
fair point.
that's why it's so important that our leaders explain what's at stake, why we have to do this. And then most people say, hell yeah, let's do this. Um, Clearly, we're seeing a significant increase in the use of drones, unmanned aerial systems, but also what's most interesting to me is the unmanned maritime systems that our navies, what the Ukrainians defeated the Great Black Sea Fleet without a traditional navy of their own. They did it using drones, uh, cruise missiles, sabotage, special operations, and they ran the Black Sea Fleet out of the Black Sea, literally. So that's, I think, Navy experts, I know the Canadian Navy is the same, are taking a look at, okay, are there applications for unmanned maritime systems on Canada's, not only the Arctic, but also on your Pacific and Atlantic coastlines? Now, obviously, what works inside the Black Sea might not be relevant in the North Atlantic, but this is worth looking at because, first of all, the cost of a modern warship is stupendous. And then to put 140 or 180 or whatever size ship it is, crew members on it, this is real significant investment with overhead and maintenance and so on. Whereas if you've got unmanned maritime systems that can act independently or maybe tethered to an actual crewed ship, it extends the capabilities for anti-submarine warfare, for counter-mine operations, for other intelligence collection for maritime forces. This is the U.S. Navy is putting a lot of money into this, and I suspect the Canadian Navy is as well. On the drones, certainly this has changed the character of war. There's no doubt about it. I mean, it's very difficult to sneak up on anybody anymore when you've got constant overhead coverage. But as has happened for the last 5,000 years of recorded history in warfare, uh, there's always eventually something that comes up to counter it.
Right.
And I think we're going to see, probably we're already seeing the beginnings of it, a wide range of capabilities that are developed that can defeat or at least neutralize or degrade drones from the other side. Now, some of this is rudimentary stuff, shooting them down. I watched a video of a Rheinmetall vehicle the other day that shot down 5 different Shahed drones. It's just got a very good radar system and a gun that's able to do that. So that's kinetic. And then, of course, if these are not autonomous drones, you can sometimes break the signal, and you get them that way. But I think as artificial intelligence becomes more and more developed and useful, you can imagine that one side will deploy a large swarm of their own drones to counter the swarm that's coming in.
Right.
You know,
Well,
when I saw that movie, I think Olympus Has Fallen, or the one where Morgan Freeman is the president, and his whole detail gets wiped out by drones,
right.
except for one guy. I was like, oh, come on, that's never going to happen. That's exactly what's happening now. And so I think we need to assume that there will be a counter to drones in the very near future.
Well, let's stick on AI for a second. And I mean, I see AI really as, particularly in military sphere, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I have no military experience, so perhaps I'm speaking out of turn, but I see it as similar to stock market trading and chip design. At first computers were an edge, and now kind of with the widespread adoption of algorithmic trading, people are removed from the minutia of individual trades, which take place at speeds and frequencies that people can't comprehend. And similarly, our newest GPU chips done by NVIDIA are being designed by AI models. We don't understand why they operate more efficiently, but they do. Computers themselves are designing computers. And the way I look at war is that this is bound to happen to war as well. What, in your mind, does war planning look like when generals are planning strategy, but they're increasingly unable to plan tactics because those tactics are being taken over by, as you say, swarms of drones that are attacking other swarms of drones, and the minutia are being determined by machines.
So first of all, I think of drones as that's a capability, like vehicles, airplanes, different types of weapons. It's another thing that can give you advantage in terms of speed, surveillance, strike. Okay, it's a thing. And so the key is to get those capabilities into situations that help you achieve whatever your objective is. You still cannot hold terrain with a drone. You can't seize terrain with a drone. It's a thing that helps you seize or defend uh, in combat. So the side which is best and quickest at implementing that is the one that's going to succeed. Now, the let me give you two or three examples of where AI is already being used in warfare. I don't want to be too specific about this, but just know that headquarters, some very large headquarters, um, are able to train their artificial intelligence to help them develop courses of action and to do war gaming of those courses of action. And the way they do it is when they're going through the intelligence briefings and the commanders giving guidance. They said, hey, I'd like to be able, how do we address this particular challenge, or how do we do this? And all of this is being recorded and fed into the devices that are used that enable the artificial intelligence to absorb all this incredible amount of information faster than any dudes with pen and paper could have ever done. And then it goes into the process that then spits out, hundreds of possible courses of action that the admiral or the general might want for whatever the mission is. So this is a part of how it helps in planning and war gaming and developing courses of action. That's one thing. And like always with any sort of automation, it's what you build into it. Another more another not rudimentary, but a different aspect of artificial intelligence that I think is very important, and it kind of alludes to what you just said, is how do you build in ethics when devices can make decisions about the use of lethal force faster than any human could possibly do it? How do you make sure that the way that lethal force is being employed, the ethics are somehow baked in? I would have never even thought of that until I participated in a workshop where one particular company is making aircraft, and the particular nation has a real interest in making sure that weapons are not getting used without humans somehow being involved in it. And so they're looking for ways to build in the ethical considerations. I don't know how. I just gave them the types of situations that they might encounter. And then can you build that in? I think those are realistic considerations, because at the end of the day, our parliament, our Congress, our Bundestag, or whatever, um, they're going to expect that we do things in an ethical way.
Absolutely. And I take what you're saying about how all these things are tools, and fundamentally your answer to some of the previous questions are saying, listen, at the end of the day, there's humans behind this. It needs to have a human component. These are just tools. But there is something to the idea that there are emergent qualities to these tools. And those emergent qualities sometimes take on characteristics that go well beyond tools. As an example, individual cars are tools, but traffic is an emergent quality of cars, right? And there are features that you then have to deal with. And so it is with AI and swarms of machines that are ultimately all individual tools, but collectively become something more. I'm I, I, from a military history perspective, when this conflict is over, what will this war be known for amongst military historians? Is it something about like will they look on this and say this was the beginning of artificial intelligence battles and which go far beyond humans? Is this going to be known for something else?
Well, boy, that's a very interesting and very broad question.
Yes, sorry, I should have been a bit more
No,
specific.
no, no, it's okay. It's a good question. I think your audience is lucky to have somebody like you that poses these are not standard sort of questions. So from a strategic historical standpoint, what I think we're going to look back and see missed opportunity. I mean, Russia should have been defeated 2 years ago. And if the United States and others had said, this is our strategic outcome, is that Russia learns to live within its own boundaries. And, we'd be in a much different place. The security environment of Europe could have been fixed for the next 2 or 3 generations even. And then Russia only does reform after it is defeated in war. Now we may have missed that opportunity for now. That's one thing we're going to look back on. The second thing that I think people will look back on is how how incredible it was that Ukraine, which very few people expected to do what they did, um, that here we are 11 and a half years into this war. Russia has lost over 1 million casualties. Their Great Black Sea Fleet is no longer a factor. The Russian Air Force does not dare fly into Ukrainian airspace, and they still only control about 19% of Ukraine. After 11 and a half years, with every advantage, they can't defeat Ukraine. And that goes to when President Trump, that awful day when he was yelling at President Zelensky in the Oval Office, and he said, "You got no cards." I mean, it showed that my president has no understanding of why people fight. That this is not, who's got the most cards. I mean, conceivably, the Taliban had no cards, but they defeated us, or the Viet Cong had no cards, but they defeated us, or the colonials had no cards, but we defeated Great Britain. So the Ukrainians reminded us of the human factor in warfare. It's not just a big giant math problem.
Mhm.
And then finally, how quickly new technologies were unleashed on this battlefield and how quickly they were able to adapt. Um, Ukraine was always the heart of the Soviet Union's defense industry. So after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine still was this hub. It had a lot of, I think, residual engineering and technical expertise there, which is part of why maybe they were so effective at doing what they have been doing. That when they sank that stinking Russian, the flagship, the Moskva, you remember that a couple of years
Indeed.
ago. Yeah, they did that with a couple of drones and their own Ukrainian-produced anti-ship missile. I think that was the first time it had been used in combat. So it was
Mhm.
a combination of really good tactics, good technology, and also understanding. Everybody in Ukrainian Navy knew everything about that ship because it had been there in Sevastopol, based there. The Ukrainians knew that that thing had 1980s technology radar that was only 180, not a 360 radar. So they developed the tactics for that. That's the kind of stuff I think that we're going to remember.
Very interesting. General, you've been remarkably generous with your time, and I'm very appreciative. You'll permit me one final question that I personally want to know about. I don't know if my audience wants to know about it, but I do, because I see if Russia is to lose this war, I think it loses it because of its own economy, nothing to do with military. I think I'm watching the economic trends in Russia trend ever downward, inflation ever higher, lack of resources, lack of personnel that can ultimately continue the industry because they're all being headed to, they're all going to the front. And more importantly, Ukraine is kicking out from under them. I mean, some people have said Russia is nothing more than a mafia with a gas station, and they're setting the gas station on fire. So that being the case, I'm curious because I know very little about the American military the way you do. To what degree does the military analyze the basic economic factors at play within the country? What tabs are they keeping on that? And when you give an assessment saying, listen, the war may be won or lost, how are you factoring in that economic vantage?
So, what another great question. And I agree with you that ultimately, what's going to bring Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table is going to be when the United States and Canada and other countries finally use the economic leverage we have that would wreck their oil export business. About 70% of Russia's oil goes to India and China. So if we can disrupt that, these shadow fleet vessels going in and out of the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, you can disrupt that, as well as utilizing the frozen Russian assets to help pay for things for Ukraine. And also probably we ought to be able, working with partners, to manipulate the market enough that it wrecks Russia's economy. And also, by the way, giving the Ukrainians the ability to reach deep to strike and hit that oil and gas infrastructure. These are the kind of things that are going to be real consequences for the Kremlin. And I
Mhm.
think that's when we start, because they don't care about how many casualties they have. Um, I think this is how uh, it eventually ends. And so, of course, in the development of strategy, and I know it sounded a little bit like a scratched record, but this is not some nice to have thing. It is the essential thing to have. What is your clearly defined objective? What are you trying to accomplish? And so, when we develop strategy, we use it's a very, very simple structure, but something you learn at staff college is called DIME, D-I-M-E, Diplomacy, Information, Military, and Economy. These are kind of the four big pillars of national or coalition power: diplomatic power, information power, military power, and economic power. And of course, it works also when you evaluate your adversary. How are they in these sort of things? So the economic considerations are a very important part of this. When you think about production of ammunition, production of equipment, repair parts, fuel, all the stuff you need to fight and deter. So the industry is a critical part of that. The CIA always, that was one of their principal tasks, was to have an understanding of the economic uh, viability, uh, crop production, et cetera, of adversaries or potential adversaries. So yes, it's a very important part.
Okay. Well, that that's a comprehensive answer. General, you've been, as I said, you've been remarkably grateful. I'm remarkably grateful, and you've been very generous with your time. The fact that you would come on to a smaller show like this speaks to the way that you give back to those people who are seeking to understand the events that shape our world. I'm grateful. My listeners are grateful. And I would, of course, welcome you back anytime that you would want to come back on Brave New Something. It would be a pleasure to have you here.
Well, I enjoyed it. I meant it when I said two or three times, you asked really, really good questions that are not a standard sort of yes, no kind of question. And you made me think about it. And I probably mangled two or three of the answers as well. But this is complex stuff. And I think your audience is lucky to have you, Mark.
Well, that's very kind. Thank you very much, General. And I'm going to wish you a wonderful rest of your day. I guess you're out in Europe now, so I guess the wonderful rest of your evening.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
My very best. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Please hit that like, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single second of our content. Looking forward to seeing you guys at our next interview. Everyone, take care.